In the days before intercontinental ballistic missiles, the superpowers worked in secret to design and build fleets of amazing bombers to deliver death and destruction to their enemies. The result? Flying battleships and nuclear-powered aircraft. This is the story of just how close Congress came to scrapping America's aircraft carriers, until the U.S. Navy found a daring last-minute way to launch a nuclear strike bomber from a carrier deck. Of how the Soviet Union deliberately hoaxed the United States into believing Russia had giant bombers light years ahead of their time in full-scale production, and how the most potent supersonic low-level bomber ever flown was scrapped because the politicians were scared it was too good. This is the secret history of those bombers and of the extraordinary men who built and flew them. July 1955, Moscow. In the war of technology, Communist Russia is preparing to spring a trap on America and her NATO allies. The setting, a harmless air show in the heart of the city.
While the tanks and missiles rumbled past on the ground, a whole lot of new airplanes came by overhead. And one of these really took the Americans' breath away because it was a big four-jet bomber.
The new bomber is called the Myasishchev M4. NATO gives it the code name Bison. The aircraft sends shockwaves through the U.S. High Command.
The West was quite concerned about the Bison bomber because for the first time the Soviet Union had the ability with that airplane to come across the North Pole and attack our major cities, Chicago, New York.
Off the wingtips were 4 MiG-17s as an escort. Well, the Russians were very good to give it a MiG-17 escort because it enabled the Americans instantly to scale off the wingspan of the MiG-17 and decide exactly how big this four-jet bomber was. And they were rather astonished.
The Bison is as big as America's giant B-52. But instead of the B-52's 8 engines, the Bison needs only 4 huge turbojets.
The appearance of the Bison at one of the mid-50 air shows caused alarm and despondency amongst the ranks of the American military. Essentially, it was perceived that this was a demonstration of how lethal and effective the Soviet bomber force was becoming.
One thing we really didn't know was how many of these were being produced, how many of these were being introduced into flight testing, how many of these were being introduced into operational service.
A young Strategic Air Command pilot, Hal Austin, is ordered to fly over the Soviet Union to find out where the Bison squadrons are hidden.
Well, at our morning briefing, the commander come in and grabbed my arm after the usual weather briefing, route briefing, and so on, and says, "Come down here." We went into a target study room, and 2 colonels that I'd never seen before, turned out to be SAC intelligence, laid out a strip map. I saw Archangels and Murmansk, and I thought, whoops, I recognize those names from our emergency order, war order preparation. And anyway, I says, "What's this?" He says, "This is the mission you're going to go on." I says, "By ourselves?" He said, "Yes, you're the only airplane going to be doing this."
Flying a Boeing B-47 bomber, Austin and his co-pilot Carl Holt make their dash into the Soviet Union from the Arctic Circle.
We're told to climb to 40,000 feet, which was a little above our optimum altitude for our fuel weight. We had asked during the briefing from these 2 colonels, why 40,000 feet? That's going to cost us some airspeed. They said, well, the MiG-15 fighter, which is supposed to be the only one deployed in great numbers, can't get to 40,000 feet. What about the MiG-17? We'd heard this in our emergency war order briefings. Well, it may be out there, but they're not deployed in numbers. So don't worry too much about the MiG-17.
But the Soviet Air Force was prepared to defend the secret of the Bison.
Carl Holt says, "Wait a minute, these guys are at our altitude." And here we are supposed to only have MiG-15s deployed in numbers. So I said, well, it must be not MiG-15s, probably MiG-17s. And all of a sudden I see white phosphorus shells going by both above and below the canopy from the left rear. And Carl Holt says, "These SOBs are shooting at us." And I said, well, you better get those guns working back there. Enough of that 40,000 feet stuff. I pushed the nose over and went down 4,000 or 5,000 feet, picked up about 20 knots indicated airspeed, which may be one of the reasons I'm talking right now. We did complete the next target and then turned to cover the Bison bomber base on the way out.
But Austin's B-47 had been badly damaged by the MiGs.
The bottom of the wing had about an 8-inch hole, and the shell had scattered with some 40 or 50 holes into the fuselage along the left main tank. Carl Holt was convinced we weren't going to have enough fuel to get back on the ground, and his statement was, if we don't get back with this film, we won't be able to prove to anybody where we've been.
Fortunately, Austin is able to rendezvous with a SAC tanker plane just as the last of his fuel runs out.
It was 40 years later before we saw into that film, because we asked General LeMay if we could see the film. He said, no, it's too highly classified. But he did tell us we'd got all 9 airfield targets, and that made us very pleased about it.
America will pour billions of dollars into a new generation of fighters and anti-aircraft missiles to defend against the mighty Bison. But the Americans were fooled by an elaborate Soviet hoax.
The Americans had been deliberately hoodwinked. The Soviet Air Force didn't have 18 Bisons. It had no Bisons in operational service. What they had done is take a handful of prototype aircraft and fly the same planes around and around over Moscow to give the impression they had more than were actually there.
I didn't know this at the time we flew that mission, but I found out years later that there was only 2 bombers on that base, 2 Bison bombers on that base where we took pictures of.
Suckered by this hoax, U.S. intelligence estimates that the Russians have 700 Bison operational. In fact, only 35 Bison bombers are ever built. What the U.S. doesn't know is that secretly the Bison is a technological failure.
What we did not realize at that time was that Soviet engine technology was not really matching the ability of designers to develop airframes. The fuel consumption characteristics of these engines were relatively deficient.
Because of its gas-guzzling engines, the Bison couldn't even reach the United States except on a one-way flight. And even then it's arguable whether it could carry a decent bomb load. But the Americans didn't find all of this out for years to come.
In World War II, the strategic bomber reached the furthest extent of its development in America with the emergence of the superlative B-29, the highest-flying, furthest-ranging bomber of the war. In contrast, the Russians had focused their efforts on building tactical aircraft to support the Red Army and had woefully neglected their bomber force.
I think by 45 they knew they had to do something and do it pretty damn quick, and they didn't have any history of making those kind of aircraft. So what do? They say, well, when the opportunity occurs, we'll steal it.
That opportunity presents itself in the last year of the war, when several damaged B-29s land in Russia after bombing Japan. Stalin repatriates the airmen, but he keeps the planes.
Now, the role of Stalin in all of this is really interesting. As ruthless and cruel and as arbitrary as he could be, he was nevertheless a very shrewd man when it came to air power. He decided in 1945 that the Soviet Union should take the 3 intern B-29s that had landed in the Soviet Far East and use these as a template to copy the Boeing Superfortress design.
Copying of the B-29 was a major industrial task. Stalin needed someone very capable to run the show. This was Andrei Tupolev, probably Russia's greatest ever aircraft designer. The scale of the project is almost unimaginable. Tupolev organizes 900 factories and hundreds of thousands of workers to copy this bomber.
After what is one of the greatest engineering feats of the 20th century, the first Soviet B-29 copy flies in May 1947. Only 2 years after the start of the project to reverse engineer the Boeing bomber. But the only way the Soviet B-29 can reach America is on a one-way suicide mission.
I certainly knew as a planner that the Soviets would plan one-way missions and probably come a whole lot nearer executing a one-way mission than we in the United States would.
The alternative to a one-way suicide mission is airborne refueling. But it will take the Soviets decades to catch up with the West in perfecting aerial flight refueling techniques.
Aerial refueling presupposes that you have distributed bases to operate your tankers from, and there weren't many circumstances in which they could possibly have done that. When they did develop a number of bases overseas, for example, when they had Cuba to call upon, well, then they started taking a look at aerial refueling in a more serious way.
In desperation, the Russians gambled everything on building the Bison. They pushed the technological envelope to its limit.
But where did the Russians get the idea for the Bison? Once again, that was the product of foreign technology.
At the very end of World War II, the Russians captured many of Germany's best aircraft designers and took them as forced labor to work in the Soviet Union to design aircraft for the Russians. This included the Junkers design team, who were working on an experimental 6-engine jet bomber. When you see it, it looks just like the Bison.
But with the failure of the gas-guzzling Bison, the Soviets become desperate for alternative ways of attacking the continental United States. This search will lead to one of the most incredible Russian bomber projects of all time. And the man behind this great machine was not a Russian, but an Italian. By the middle of the 1950s, the Red Air Force had thoroughly duped the Americans into believing it had hundreds of Bison bombers ready to strike at U.S. cities. In reality, the Soviets know they still lack a way of reaching the continental United States. Then, an innovative aviation designer comes up with a solution. Build bombers that can land on the sea and refuel from Soviet submarines. There's only one problem with this idea. The genius is not Russian, but Italian.
His name has practically been erased from history, Roberto Bartini. Fellow Russian aircraft designers were jealous of him. Stalin was suspicious of him because he was a foreigner. His contribution to Soviet aircraft and rocket technology is one of Russia's best-kept secrets.
Roberto Oros di Bartini was born in 1897 in a part of northeastern Italy, which is now in modern Serbia. When the First World War broke out, young Roberto joined the army and learned to fly. Bartini was an idealist, and with the rise of fascism, he joined the fledgling Italian Communist Party, hoping to save his country from Mussolini. In 1923, Mussolini seized power in Italy and began sending communists like Bartini to prison camps. Bartini fled to Soviet Russia to avoid imprisonment. He soon found himself in a senior design position in the new Soviet aircraft industry.
In the 1920s, young men who were thrilled by the idea of communism, and there were quite a few, a lot of them managed to go to the Soviet Union. And the extraordinary thing is that the Russians tended to regard them with suspicion. And even if they proved that their heart was in the right place, like Bartini worked his socks off designing aeroplanes for the Russians, he still was regarded with suspicion.
In 1933, his Stahl 6 design held the world speed record.
Bartini, before World War II, was developing some very high-speed aircraft. There was a fighter proof-of-concept aircraft known as the Stahl 6. He developed the Stahl 7, which was a twin-engined airliner in the 1930s, and that again had a very good performance, so much so that it was developed into one of the mainstay bombers of the Great Patriotic War.
Bartini's DB-240 would be the first Red Air Force bomber to raid Hitler's Berlin. But Bartini would never get the credit for his visionary design. He had actually been arrested in the great Stalinist purges that engulfed the Soviet aircraft industry after 1937.
Bartini's a good communist, so he's shocked by his arrest. Time goes by and he's in prison, and the head of the Soviet secret police, Beria, comes for a visit. Bartini knew Beria. He goes to him and says, "I'm innocent. Why am I in jail?" Beria laughs. He says, "I know you're innocent, Roberto. If you were guilty, I'd have had you shot. What you're going to do for me now is you're going to design me a brilliant plane, you'll get the Stalin Prize, and I'll set you free."
During his period in prison, Bartini was a mentor to several young Russian designers. One of these was Sergei Korolev, later the genius behind the Soviet manned space program. Korolev worked in Bartini's department and considered Bartini his teacher. When Bartini was granted his freedom, he moved to Siberia, where he worked as head of future projects at the Siberian Scientific Institute of Aerodynamics. Here, in the early 1950s, he set about tackling Russia's need for long-range bombers.
At the end of the 1950s, the Soviet bomber program is a failure. The Bison doesn't work, the Bear is too slow, they need another answer, and that's where Bartini reappears.
Bartini's idea was to build a supersonic flying boat bomber. It was called the Bartini A-57.
Bartini's final designs were quite extraordinary. They were, if you can imagine, a large aeroplane with a huge battery of lift jet engines pointing downwards in the middle, and then big jet engines at the back to push it along. And the idea was you could take off from land or water. You didn't need a runway, you didn't need an airfield, really.
A flying boat bomber would solve the range problem at a stroke. It could land on the water and refuel and rearm from a nearby submarine.
But Bartini also wanted speed. After lengthy experiments in a secret Siberian wind tunnel, Bartini perfected what he called the Bartini wing. This is a long, slender delta for high supersonic speed. The A-57 was designed to land and take off from either ice or water, which made it capable of operating from bases near the North Pole. It would be powered by 5 jet engines, set in a row on top of the fuselage. It would have a top speed of 1,500 miles per hour. With virtually unlimited range, it could hit any target on Earth. It would have been the most formidable bomber yet built. In the event of emergency, the A-57 could come down on land using a large skid, and operating in secret from water or ice sheet, it would have been practically invulnerable to attack. In April 1957, Bartini is ordered back to Moscow from Siberia. He is assigned to lead a special design group to build the A-57. For the unrepentant Italian communist, this is recognition at last by his adopted homeland. But fate has other ideas.
Barely 6 months after his return to Moscow, in October 1957, Bartini's great protege, Sergei Korolev, launches the world's first Sputnik. The Russians decide that maybe missiles are a better way to go than bombers. Unfortunately, that means they cancel Bartini's amazing A-57 bomber project.
Well, as soon as the Soviets had an effective missile program in place that could deliver a large number of missiles against America or the rest of Europe, then the bombers really do take the backstage.
But the world had not seen the last of the secretive Roberto Bartini. His final design, completed before his death in 1974, was the bizarre VVA-14. After the A-57's cancellation, Bartini continued to be fascinated by amphibious planes. He developed the notion of a plane that lands not on wheels, but on a cushion of air. Such a machine was capable of taking off and landing anywhere, on land, sea, or ice.
Essentially what Bartini was seeking to build was not a high-flying bomber, but a low-flying battleship capable of cruising close to the surface and carrying a huge arsenal of weapons.
The economic collapse of communism in the Soviet Union saw the end of Russian interest in such weapons. Bartini's last design now lies rusting in a Russian field. Few who see it today would know anything about Roberto Bartini, the Italian who helped create Soviet Russia's military might.
He was a really old man when he died, but if you say, what did he leave behind? Well, the answer is a fertile mind, a brilliant array of extraordinary flying machines. Not one of them could be called a failure.
But Russia was not the only superpower with plans for extraordinary bombers. American planners envisioned a bomber that could fly for years on end without refueling. In the early 1950s, in-flight refueling is in its infancy. But America needs a bomber to reach targets deep inside Soviet Russia. A bomber with a range of tens of thousands of miles. The answer? A radical new kind of engine, one that's powered by a miniature nuclear reactor.
You have to understand the general image of nuclear power, and in the early 50s there was this sort of parallel concept of nuclear power was going to be an enormous benefit to mankind in the late 40s, early 50s, where we were going to have electrical generation, all the power plants were going to be nuclear. People were talking about building a new Panama Canal with nuclear demolition devices. So people thought, well, infinite energy, why not miniaturize a nuclear reactor and make it the source of power for a bomber?
The big advantage that people saw for a nuclear-powered aircraft was simply that the flight duration could be extended indefinitely. That meant the range could be anything you wanted. It means they could stand on station if they were for defensive or observational purposes.
In 1946, under the leadership of General Curtis LeMay, the United States Air Force set up a task force to investigate the possibilities of building an atom-powered bomber. But LeMay's atomic bomber, which sounded simple in theory, seemed impossible to engineer in practice. How, for instance, would the crew be shielded from the dangerous radiation?
You had to use all these tricks, like base it on uninhabited islands and things like that. Use old men for the pilots so that the effect of radiation on the gene, on the sperm would not get into children.
To gain experience in radiation shielding, the Americans decided to build a flying reactor. Fortunately, they had to hand an aircraft big enough to carry such a reactor, the Convair B-36. It was so big, the crews called it the magnesium overcoat.
In 1953, an ordinary B-36 bomber is modified to carry a small reactor in the rear bomb bay. The reactor is not connected to the engines. A new nose section houses a 12-ton lead-shielded compartment for the crew. The aircraft is given the designation NB-36, the N standing for nuclear. The first NB-36 test flight is on September 17, 1955. The tests prove that the radiation can be contained, provided there is heavy shielding. The next challenge is to build an atomic-powered jet engine. The theory of an atomic engine is simpler than an ordinary jet. Air is sucked in and fed to the nuclear reactor, where it is heated. The air expands at super rapid speed and pushes the plane forward. This simple plan will need very complicated engineering. U.S. scientists come up with two competing ways to build an atomic jet engine. The first is called the direct cycle method.
Well, the advantage of direct power is that it's simpler. There are almost no moving parts. The air goes into the reactor, passes through a lot of little holes through the reactor, comes out hot. So in principle, it's simpler.
But the direct cycle engine has a major drawback. Air passing through the reactor core becomes irradiated. The aircraft leaves a trail of dangerous irradiated particles in its wake. This led American scientists to propose a second kind of atomic motor called the indirect cycle.
The other approach was to have a reactor separate from the propulsion system, which would produce lots of energy, heat. Then that energy would be transferred from the reactor to a propulsion unit, a jet-like propulsion unit, through the use of hot liquid metal.
The indirect cycle has the advantage that air avoids passing through the reactor. Instead, liquid metal carries the heat from the reactor to the air. But this method requires a lot of complex and heavy plumbing. While the General Electric Company begins work on a prototype atomic jet engine, the Air Force draws up plans for a real atomic bomber. Engineering is entrusted to Convair, builders of the B-36. The new bomber is called the WS-125. Designers declare it the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft.
The Air Force developed a lot of formal administrative techniques, and one was to classify programs, and WS just stands for weapon system, and they all had numbers, and the WS-125 was a nuclear airplane.
In 1956, the General Electric Company gets a prototype of the direct cycle nuclear jet engine working. But the thrust produced by the prototype engine is nowhere near enough to lift the plane, with its heavy load of radiation shielding, off the ground. Curtis LeMay and the U.S. Air Force seek more money from Congress for more research, but they run up against an unexpected obstacle: President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower is suspicious of both Curtis LeMay and the military-industrial complex. He orders a halt to the WS-125 bomber until the atomic jet engine is perfected. But then on December 1st, 1958, Aviation Week, America's most authoritative defense journal, splashes an amazing story. The Soviet Union has already flown an atom-powered bomber.
They had a picture of us. It was just an artist's conception, but it was a nuclear-propelled airplane.
It looks like the Russians are ahead technologically. A campaign is launched by the Air Force and sympathetic politicians to get the WS-125 built and into the air.
I remember one classified meeting we had with one of the military appropriations committees of the House of Representatives about this Aviation Week article. Why aren't you guys doing so? Don't you understand how important this is?
The new Soviet aircraft is the work of the same Russian company behind the design. The plane is given the NATO code name Bounder. Americans wonder how the Soviets could overtake the U.S. in nuclear-powered planes. Reluctantly, President Eisenhower increases the budget for America's atom plane project. He puts the project under management he can trust, his chief scientific advisor, Herbert York.
By that time, I had already developed very substantial doubts about its practicality. The goal is a reasonable goal. I mean, an airplane with an indefinite flight time. But the practicality, and I could summarize it in 3 different areas, all of which are closely related. One is that airplanes are subject to crashing. The idea of flying around with a reactor, which, sadly might crash anywhere, is just not something which could be made acceptable. The second point is that, especially on the direct drive, it was inevitable that it would constantly be spewing radioactivity out the tail. And the other one was the pilots. I mean, the question of shielding the pilots was a serious one.
Backed by Eisenhower, York imposes new requirements on the project. He cancels further development of the WS-125 airframe as being premature. Instead, work will concentrate on getting a foolproof engine working.
It was more than anything else weight, that they could not miniaturize the reactor and particularly shield the crew with lightweight enough materials to result in a operationally useful bomber.
It had very few friends. It had extremely few friends in the military, and it had fewer over time. And it had extremely few friends in the atomic power community as well.
Then, in 1960, the political picture changes again. Newly elected President John F. Kennedy blames Eisenhower for the so-called Bison bomber gap. But on taking office, Kennedy discovers Eisenhower's last secret. The new U-2 spy plane has revealed the actual state of Soviet bomber and missile forces. There is no bomber gap. The Russians do not have an atomic-powered plane.
The entire Aviation Week story was yet another Soviet hoax. They had built an airplane called the Bounder, but they only ever built one prototype, and it had ordinary jet engines. In fact, it was so underpowered it couldn't go supersonic. You can still see it sitting in a field outside of Moscow.
This discovery of the truth about the Soviet nuclear plane dooms the American atomic bomber. The project is finally canceled in March 1961, a month after President Kennedy enters the White House. But while the Air Force fought for its atomic bomber, the U.S. Navy had its own battle to acquire a nuclear strike capacity. The result is one of the most unorthodox carrier bombers of all time. The Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific, 1946. The United States Navy wants to know how the new atomic bomb will affect war at sea. To find out, the Navy decides to drop a nuclear weapon on a fleet of more than 90 empty vessels assembled in the Bikini Lagoon. The entire fleet is pulverized, but there is a problem. The atomic bomb is delivered at Bikini by an Army Air Force B-29 bomber. Early nuclear weapons, some weighing 10,000 pounds, are too large for the Navy planes, carried aboard an aircraft carrier.
The US Navy was worried that atomic warfare would be dominated by the Air Force, and the Navy itself reduced to merely a transport force.
They had way over half the defence budget, which was enormous. You know, they'd gone from nothing, a few dozen old B-17s and B-29s. Suddenly, there they are with hundreds and hundreds of bases all over the world, 2,500 jet bombers, a huge number of personnel.
Air Force General Curtis LeMay immediately begins a campaign to have the Navy's new generation of supercarriers canceled and the money spent instead on bombers.
The three services had to scramble to redefine what their roles and missions were in the post-war environment with all this new technology and nuclear weapons. And the Air Force pulled out in front as the owner of the assets that deliver strategic nuclear weapons.
The U.S. Navy must find a way of putting an atomic bomb on a plane that can take off and land on a carrier deck. Otherwise, it's finished as a major service. There's only one possible candidate. The Navy already has a new land-based patrol plane that's just big enough to carry an atomic bomb. But could it possibly struggle off the deck of a carrier? The airplane is the U.S. Navy's latest anti-submarine bomber, the Lockheed P-2V Neptune. The Neptune is a big plane. It has a 100-foot wingspan and weighs as much as a loaded B-17. Can a Neptune actually get off a carrier deck? There is only one way to find out. On April 27, 1948, a Neptune is loaded by crane aboard the U.S. Navy carrier Coral Sea. Stripped of unnecessary weight, it is fitted with a rocket pack to provide extra boost on takeoff. The next morning, Commander Tom Davies takes the controls of his Neptune and fires the rocket booster. Suddenly, Davies and his Neptune are airborne. The flight convinces Congress to fund the building of a new generation of aircraft carriers. The Navy is saved. But there is one major drawback with the use of the Neptune as an atomic bomber.
Couldn't land aboard the carrier, it was too big. Instead, it would ditch alongside and the crew would be rescued. It was very similar to the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in how it would be structured.
A series of trial landings on a carrier-sized runway are conducted at Patuxent Naval Air Station. All are successful. Then an actual touch-and-go landing is attempted aboard the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, but without engaging the arrestor hook. However, the admirals veto any further attempts, fearing that a crash could be disastrous.
A crash at that time would have destroyed the US Navy's public relations exercise, so they decided to play safe and just keep the Neptune as a one-way mission aircraft. As ever, the real battle was against the Air Force, not the Russians.
On June 25, 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. 6 days later, with the world on the brink of a major confrontation, President Truman orders that the components for 15 atomic bombs be stored aboard the aircraft carrier USS Coral Sea, which is bound for the Mediterranean with its Neptunes. In the event that the Korean conflict turned into war with the Soviet Union, the Neptunes would have been launched against Soviet targets.
Could a Neptune bomber have reached its target with an atomic bomb? Perhaps in the chaos of war, but it was a very slow-moving aircraft, and I think it highly unlikely.
With the world edging toward nuclear annihilation, aircraft over the Soviet Union are on edge and trigger-happy.
One of the examples of an incident that we got involved with that was a little hairy was we were headed south. We had just passed Vladivostok, which was the Soviet Far East Naval Headquarters. And we probably might have been a little bit closer than we should have been. We were jumped by a MiG coming probably out of North Korea. And the North Koreans were kind of crazy. They were trigger happy. We were probably at about 1,500 to 2,000 feet, and we immediately descended to under 100 feet. We went as low as we could possibly go, and it was very, very hairy. And we lost the MiG. And the reason we lost them is because we know that a fighter aircraft does not have the margin of safety that we would have at low altitude.
The Navy's Neptune bombers are soon replaced with dedicated carrier jets, operating from a new breed of carrier. Then, in the 1960s, the Navy abandons carrier-based nuclear strike planes altogether in favor of the nuclear submarine.
The primary task of the Neptune was to hunt Soviet submarines. In the end, it wasn't land-based missiles, it wasn't bombers. The major threat to the United States came from Soviet submarines. To take them out, you couldn't afford to be sophisticated. You had to nuke them.
One man who flew such missions in a Neptune was Carlos Campbell.
We were flying in an exercise out of Midway. We had a nuclear weapon on board. Immediately upon takeoff, we had a fire in the starboard engine. And I'll never forget it because the flames were gushing out. So we shut the engine down. We could have continued to altitude and everybody could have bailed out. We could have ditched the aircraft, but that would have been dicey because of the coral reefs around Midway Island. We could have landed heavy. That had its question mark only because we had more fuel than we needed to have, and it wasn't, and you can't dump fuel with the fire, right? Because that could ruin your afternoon. Or we could have done nothing, and I couldn't tell you the story. So we landed heavy. But the fire crews were fantastic at the naval stations, and they covered the aircraft with foam and put it out within a matter of minutes.
The advent of the missile era affects the Air Force as well as the Navy. New air-to-air missiles like the American Sidewinder make the manned bomber vulnerable. What the U.S. military do not know is that the Soviets already have their hands on the deadly Sidewinder itself. In 1958, the Chinese Communists launch attacks on their nationalist adversaries based in Taiwan. The nationalists have U.S.-supplied F-86 Sabres, equipped with the new Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. These are being tested in combat for the first time.
The Sidewinder proved devastating to the Red Chinese MiGs. In one battle, the Sabres downed 10 MiGs for no loss to themselves.
But these skirmishes have a dangerous outcome that no one in the West will suspect for years to come.
A Sidewinder fired by a Taiwanese Sabre lodged in the tailpipe of a Red Chinese MiG-17, but it didn't go off. The MiG-17 got back to its base, they recovered the missile, and very quickly it was on its way to Moscow to be examined.
The Soviet engineers are amazed by their prize. One leading Soviet missile engineer later comments, "The Sidewinder missile was to us a university offering a course in missile construction." The Russians copy the Sidewinder. It becomes the standard Soviet air-to-air missile. NATO gives it the codename Atoll.
With the Atoll, plus a new generation of ground-to-air missiles, high-flying bomber attacks against the Soviet Union had become suicidal.
We had to get out of the high-altitude business altogether because a Strategic Air Command airplane couldn't survive that missile threat.
The result is a dramatic change in bomber tactics at the start of the 1960s. From now on, bombers will attack at low level, below radar cover.
It's very difficult if you're flying at sea level, dropping nuclear weapons. There was a way that we devised of doing it. You pulled up into a steep climb and you tossed the bomb either ahead or over your shoulder, and then you either went this way or that to avoid it.
The first country to build such a bomber is Britain. It is called the TSR-2, standing for Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance Aircraft No. 2.
The TSR-2 was an extraordinary machine for its time. It was world-class. It was well ahead of the state-of-the-art. It was very challenging because it was ahead of the state-of-the-art.
The biggest challenge of TSR-2 was reliably flying faster than sound in very dense sea-level air. You have enormous forces on the aircraft. If the tail controls, for example, suddenly went 1 degree out, you could break the aircraft up in the air simply because you would suddenly apply enormous forces to it.
These tough requirements demanded a wonder plane. Not even American engineers thought they could pull it off. But the British had their backs to the wall. This was their last chance. And amazingly enough, they produced a miracle.
The secret of the new plane lay in two technical breakthroughs. First, it carries a new kind of jet engine called a turbofan. It is more powerful than any other in use, capable of great fuel economy for strategic range.
Pretty much the same engines that drove the Concorde supersonic airliner. That gives you an idea of the kind of power that the TSR-2 had.
The TSR-2 also has a revolutionary sideways radar system that allows the pilot to literally see where he is flying, day and night, in any weather and at any level.
Up at the front were the pilot and navigator, and in front of them was a very special radar which could guide you. Without going into the ground, it could guide you along the undulations of the terrain.
The first TSR-2 flies on September 27, 1964. The timing couldn't be better. The Vietnam conflict is escalating, and America finds herself without a medium-sized bomber. The TSR-2, manufactured in America, would be a godsend. But developing a new bomber is expensive. The new government in Britain is appalled by the cost of the TSR-2.
In about spring 1964, the British Labour Party was thinking, how can we win the election that's coming up in, I think, October? And they very soon realised that these terribly expensive aeroplanes could be portrayed as a huge waste of money.
Rival companies in America also have their own agenda. Instead of the TSR-2, U.S. Secretary of State Robert McNamara orders a new American bomber, the Swing-Wing F-111, built by General Dynamics.
Instead of simply saying we will cancel TSR-2, the Harold Wilson government said we can replace it with a cheap American aeroplane, the F-111, which had all sorts of modern ideas like variable sweep, pivoted wings. What we didn't expect was that it was going to be, I wouldn't say a can of worms, but it was a terribly difficult aeroplane to develop.
On April 1st, 1965, the British cabinet votes 12-10 to cancel the TSR-2 and buy the American F-111 instead. Orders go out to destroy the TSR-2 prototypes.
My personal belief is that the TSR-2 was a program that should have been proceeded with. It was a very fine program. It was very unfortunate that it was canceled in favor of the F-111 because the F-111K, the variant that Britain would have obtained, itself became an aircraft that Britain could not afford. And TSR-2 had a lot of attributes that in the modern era still would be, I think, highly desirable in an aircraft today.
But in 1968, the British abandoned their order for the F-111 because the U.S. plane cannot meet its performance specifications and because it now costs more than the canceled TSR-2. But not all of the TSR-2 legacy is lost. The TSR-2's advanced jet engines are used to power the Concorde supersonic airliner. Iraq 2003. America's B-2 stealth bomber proves there is still a role for the big bomber.
The idea that the missile will replace the manned bomber has been proven wrong time and time again. The manned bomber is infinitely flexible. You never know which way it's going to come at you. Besides, even having a few bombers forces the other side to spend huge amounts of money on fighter defenses. We've not seen the last of the bomber.
If we take a look at attacks on German power targets in World War II, we find it took 108 B-17s, dropping 648 bombs to guarantee a 95% chance of getting 2 bombs in the target area. Now that's a tremendous investment. That's 1,080 crewmen on those 108 bombers. Going against Iraqi power generation targets, which were of the same size, it took 1 strike airplane with 1 laser-guided bomb, and that laser-guided bomb has a miss distance off the aim point of less than 10 feet. That's the era of warfare that we're really in today.
Today, China is designing a 6-engine strategic bomber. The superpowers are still waging their secret technology war for the domination of the skies.